Hey Tim, one sec, just getting my earmuffs on here.
All good.
There we go. Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad, man. How are you? Just
Doing
it's cool.
well. Good morning.
Evening to you. Afternoon.
Yeah. Um, Super excited to talk about Peirce. I haven't read Peirce for a long time, and
Mm.
it was a real treat. So suggestive, uh, this particular essay. And I thought I had when you recommended it, I guess at the Riddle, I thought I had read it before, but I don't think I have actually.
Mm.
So
It's kind of the prelude, I think, to this famous series that he published in the Monist a few years later. Um, I can't recall the exact dates, but where he kind of lays out his cosmology in more detail and in a slightly more refined way than in this essay, but this is what underpins that, I think, and I felt like it would be a really good place for us. I mean, maybe we will do some of those essays in later discussions. Someone mentioned evolutionary love, which is one of those essays, and I think we can make reference perhaps to some of that today, because that's where he defines in particular the three modes of evolution. um, but yeah, this is a really rich one because it's sort of we can see that thought process all developing, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, so you recommended this article or this essay by Peirce, and I wonder, is it because you wanted to sort of give a sense of him in the act of generating these ideas? Because it does feel like he's very much, maybe not writing these down for the first time, but trying to communicate them for the first time. And so he's very clear that he's making a hypothesis about the nature of this triadic um, relationship, that it can apply across all these different domains of not only in logic but in physiology, in physics, and psychology. But he's somewhat tentative. He's very cautious. He's like, this could. He seems surprised that it's applied so widely, this triadic relationship, but he's open to being he's a fallibilist, right? So he's open to this not actually um, playing out. So it makes it a joy to read because you really feel like you're exploring this possibility with him. Um, and of course, as a Whiteheadian, I can't help but feel the convergences on a number of points, but that might also be a function of me reading Whitehead into what Peirce is saying. And so there are a few areas where I think it'd be interesting to hear whether you felt there was a true convergence there or not. I mean, I'll just say one of those questions is on continuity. I know continuity is really important for Peirce, but I wonder if he talks about the emergence of time and space at one point in this essay, and seems to me to be putting forward some kind of a version of what Whitehead's formula for this would be, that there's a becoming of continuity and not a continuity of becoming. So
Mm.
that there's a kind of epical nature to process. It comes in these pulses, as it were. And I think I was reading Peirce as affirming that. So we don't have to drop right into that now, but it's one area where I wasn't,
Yeah,
because
that's right.
I had thought of a difference between the two of them, that Peirce was his cynicism suggested more like Bergson's position of process being uh, continuous and unbroken, which would just be distinct from Whitehead's view of that. But
Yeah, I don't think that that's exactly his view. I think like a lot of philosophers or just people who wrote over a long period of time and developed their ideas over a long period of time. And I mean, Peirce, there are like I don't know thousands of pages of Peirce, right? The collected papers, and then all of these other essays that were published in different forms and anthologized in the essential Peirce collections, in the philosophical writings of Peirce, which I've got here as well, with some overlap there. And so, I'll have the usual disclaimer: I'm not a Peirce scholar, right? Like, very much not familiar with the majority of his work, but I think cynic, so he'll talk about cynicism maybe in slightly different ways, or there'll be different. So cynicism is this principle of continuity that we're talking about, and he'll talk about that maybe in slightly different ways in different essays. But he's clear in some places that this isn't like an ultimate metaphysical principle. He's not saying that everything is necessarily continuous in that sense, which I think might be more Bergsonian in the way you're talking about it. It's a regulative principle in the Kantian sense, like it should regulate our thought without us. He's something very interesting that he says about hypostasization, which I think we should talk about as well, but
Yeah.
without us reifying or hypostasizing the principle of continuity. So he actually thinks of the principle of continuity as very closely related to both fallibilism and evolution. And of course, fallibilism is a kind of evolutionary epistemology. So that's not surprising, but he says things like a true continuum is something whose possibilities of determination no multitude of individuals can exhaust. So no matter how a continuum might be discretized, might be divided, and he says, like, no matter how many decimal points you add when you are trying to divide this thing into discrete points, you'll never exhaust the continuum. So he's a big utilizer of there's a truck going by. I don't know if you can of arguments, that make use of infinities, right? So we may talk about that as well. Like the infinite past and the infinite future play a huge role in his vision of the evolution of the universe as being a continuum. So then he's also thinking here in terms of like the infinitesimals of calculus when he's talking about, you can't divide the continuum into actual discrete parts. And he says also, the principle of continuity is the idea of fallibilism objectified. So these are very, very close. This is why it's a regulative principle. It's like an epistemological principle, right? Fallibilism is the doctrine that our knowledge is never absolute, but always swims in a continuum of uncertainty and of indeterminacy. Now, the doctrine of continuity is that all things so swim in continua. So it doesn't mean things can't be separate in different ways. And, he does talk about, he has that kind of image of epochal evolution and flashes and things branching apart and all that at the end of this essay, which I think you're referring to. It's really striking how many different thinkers we can see, echoed in some sense, but also anticipated. Like we can draw a lot of connections here to everything from the free energy principle to Wolfram, I think. Like there's a lot of just very, very deep evolutionary thinking going on here in Peirce. Even Everett, you could talk about, because he talks about these branches that are irrevocably separated from each other in some sense.
So importantly, Peirce would distinguish between actuals and possibles, whereas Everett does not, which is, so I think Peirce would have rejected many more interpreted. Yeah.
No, he would have. I think we can just see the way his thinking could encompass that kind of view. It wouldn't ever be, synonymous to it, or, and this would be, just to, again, we're jumping right to the end of the essay here, and I think we should dwell on the physics stuff, but maybe we'll go back and get to there. But also, even though there's some real similarities I think with some of Wolfram's ideas there. I mean, he even gets to the point where he talks about in a spatial continuum, there would be a different dimensionality at different points in space. And that's one of the like prime empirical predictions of the Wolfram physics project. So that's interesting. But Wolfram's fundamental posit, or that physics project's fundamental posit, is discretization. That's what makes a complete like a pan-computationalist perspective possible, is the fundamental posit of discreteness. And Peirce is precisely saying you can't have that.
So he's saying binary discreteness in particular, right? This kind of Boolean, like that all reality could be reduced to zeros and ones, right? And that, because there's always a third in Peirce's logic, that attempt to, and I don't know to what extent Wolfram, in his concept of the Ruliad, that it's necessarily thought of in a binary code, in terms of binary code. But is it semiotic? I don't think he's thinking of computations as semiotic in Peirce's triadic sense. It seems more like a binary operation that he's ontologizing or hypostatizing. And so Peirce is wanting us to trust our abstraction enough to go all the way down in some sense, but he wants us to, so he's not forbidding hypostatization, as you were saying.
No,
But
but
I think,
he's
go on.
forbidding ultimate discretization,
Yeah.
because that would imply a certain kind of certainty as well. That he says infallibilists believe that nature is fully discrete, because that means you can have like this atomistic idea, right? That you can have ultimate knowledge of a particular particle in some sense, and he just says that that's not possible, because these things always partake of continuity to some degree. So you could have, and he does, of course, in fallibilist, classic fallibilist terms, he has this kind of asymptotic approach to some kind of certainty. And again, that will play out in his cosmological vision of the universe and its evolution towards the non-existent but real infinite future, which is dead, right? And again, we should really elaborate these ideas. But yeah, you can't have that. You can't have as an ultimate sort of metaphysical principle discreteness, because that would imply the possibility even of some kind of certain knowledge about this discrete packet. And that Peirce would consider that a block in the path of inquiry, because you would get to a point and you would say, well, this is just how things are. This is his issue with kind of atomism, right? You get to a point and you say, this is how things are, and that's inexplicable in itself. This is just the discrete absolute state that these things are in. And Peirce is like, no, that's a block in the path of inquiry. You can never have a fact about which you declare it's inexplicable, because that would be itself an hypothesis. Your hypothesis becomes, this is a brute fact, this is inexplicable. And he says that that is a violation of what a hypothesis is in the first instance, because a hypothesis, the only value of a hypothesis or theory is its capacity to explain something observed. And if your hypothesis, therefore, is that it's inexplicable, this is a self-refuting hypothesis, basically, or it's a violation of what a hypothesis actually is. I mean, his philosophy of science is very rich, right?
Yeah. Okay, so cynicism, or Peirce's understanding of continuity, sounds to me like the equivalent of the affirmation of a relational ontology, basically, in process terms. And the question of that I was asking about the continuity of becoming versus the becoming of continuity, which is why Whitehead has an understanding of actual entities as the really real things which compose the creative advance, and out of which the creative advance composes itself, if you want to put it that way. That seems to me to be it's a distinct issue. But what you're saying about the discreteness, it's like there are these two basic positions in Western metaphysics, let's say, monism and dualism. And it's like the dualists, sometimes they end up becoming reductionistic materialists or absolute idealists. And then you have, the monists who often tend towards a kind of mysticism. And so you get, in other words, it's those who were stuck on only secondness. Those are the dualists, and then you have these degenerate positions of reductionistic materialism and absolute idealism, and then the monists are stuck on firstness, and just in the sense of that immediacy that as soon as you open your mouth to talk about, you've spoiled it. And Peirce is trying to suggest, I think, a mediating position here that acknowledges in some sense, the irreducibility of firstness and secondness. But he's finding some way to resolve the opposition between identity and opposition. And it's fascinating, and maybe a little unfortunate, but par for the course for these American pragmatists to shit on Hegel. But there's obviously so much influence here. that this Hegel's appreciation and all of the idealists from Fichte through Schelling to Hegel and back to Kant, of course, the importance of triads even in dogmatic metaphysics. I mean, and the Holy Trinity, it's there,
Yeah.
uh, deeply interwoven with the whole of the dominant religious and philosophical tradition that Peirce is inheriting in some sense, but he's emphasizing it in a unique way. And yeah, I think helps us avoid becoming hung up on true but partial perspectives, which is that
Mm.
firstness, we all have, if we're broad in our appreciation of the evidence, let's say, we have an intuition of firstness, which is like what I think motivates people who want to defend qualia sometimes. They're like, and then we have an intuition of secondness, which is like, well, no, hold on, like we can take some critical distance from this and really think through uh, what's been presented. Um, but until you're able to, acknowledge the reality of thirdness or the reality of relation as a ontological, um, I hesitate to say ground because it's kind of groundless also. But until you can inhabit that third space of being in between and being capable of like becoming conscious of a generative learning process ultimately, where you're allowing firstness to inform secondness and secondness to inform your memory, at least of firstness, then something emerges out of this uh, that's generative and literally gives rise to generals, and allows for evolution to unfold. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of wonderstruck by Peirce, uh, after having spent some time with this essay. And um, but does that distinction I was trying to make about people getting, sometimes we get hung up on secondness, sometimes we get hung up on firstness, but we need to include and transcend them both.
Yeah, I think Peirce wants to eat all the cake, like
Yeah.
um he absolutely is acknowledging the this importance of each of those perspectives. But he's saying that, if we have this triadic conception that we can encompass those without, trying to reduce one to the other. I mean, I think in a sense he is a monist, in an important sense. And I mean, he describes himself as an objective idealist. In fact, he says that that's the only intelligible metaphysical position, which
Mhm.
is again something to get into. And we get to another place we're going to find a big convergence with Whitehead, and I think the convergences are real. I mean, look, I've read both of them as well, and it's how does one know how one would read them if one hadn't? So it's very difficult to avoid reading them into one another. And of course, that I see them both as just great generalizers of what I think of as a fundamental evolutionary logic. So I have to read. That's just my limitation or my grounding. I have to read both of them through that lens. So we're always reading and understanding analogically, and that is sort of the point that Peirce is making as well.
Right.
But I think, yeah, he is kind of a metaphysical monist, and he's a mind first monist. But we should get into what he actually means by mind. And I mean, to cut to a certain chase, a quote that I pulled out from another essay for you from the concept of God. He says, "By experience must be understood the entire mental product." Right. So when we get into what mind means, because mind is basically the capacity to take habits. I mean, mind is the action of firstness, secondness, and thirdness and thirdness, sort of in toto, which is this creative evolution where again you've got the classic Darwinian triad, as famously articulated by Lewontin, but absolutely explicitly articulated by Peirce in this article, that firstness is spontaneity, is sporting, is chance, and anancasm is secondness. Sorry, because I haven't introduced that triad either. Tychasm is chance, is
Mhm.
firstness, is the principle of variation, in contemporary, Darwinian terms. The anincasm secondness is basically heritability, which is by evolution by law, but that's just repetition of what came before. That's consistency with what came before without any deviation, right? So like again, these are ideals. The first, seconds, and thirds are always these are idealized operations or functions.
Mhm.
Um, which I think is also an important thing. And they're also stances, they're perspectives, they're all of these things. But yeah, so absolute inheritance, perfect inheritance, that would be evolution by law, which is secondness. And of course, Peirce thinks of the mechanicist or the mechanical clockwork universe of the determinists as a world of pure secondness, right? So that's also pure efficient cause, but that's just endless repetition. So he just very, very lucidly points out, and I mean, every evolutionary thinker should understand this, right? This is basic evolutionary theory, that in a universe of pure secondness, so in a universe governed by absolute deterministic laws, there is no novelty. There's only a repetition of the same, which is why it's ultimately a Mysterian principle, which is a block in the path of inquiry, which again is Peirce's point about atomism and all of these things, because you have to postulate absolute laws which are in themselves inexplicable in order to speak of a universe of pure secondness or pure law, basically. Either they've always been that way, so it's an eternalism of repetition of the same, or they spontaneously or instantaneously, he says, actually, because he wants to reserve spontaneity for firstness, for trichasm, they instantaneously and completely inexplicably by fiat come into existence and thenceforth govern everything. So again, he makes the point there, and Peirce is a theologian, but he makes
Yeah,
the deterministic view of the laws coming into existence instantaneously is itself
creationist.
creationist view. It's entirely theological in itself. But yeah, there's no novelty. It's like people have the question like, why, one way of putting it is, why was the universe in such a low entropy state at its inception? But another way of putting that, and a more vivid way of putting it, is to say, how come all the information was already there, basically? Because there's nothing new, right? It's just a repetition of the same. So it defies any kind of notion of creativity. But that would be, that corresponds to inheritance in the classic evolutionary triad.
I just
And
love though that Peirce allows us to argue that anyone who affirms total determinism is a profoundly anti-evolutionary thinker, which who has more in common with creationists than with contemporary
yeah,
biologists.
and he makes that beautifully explicit. It's kind of obvious if you've thought through these issues, to be frank. But and one of the funny things about Peirce is that he seemed to genuinely believe that everything that he was saying was profoundly obvious. Like he's one of these. He was kind of I don't know if you would say he was like a prodigy, but he was raised. His father, Benjamin Peirce, was himself an eminent scientist and mathematician, and so he was just raised in this intellectual milieu. And he's like obviously reading tons of science as a kid, but also reads Critique of Pure Reason in his very early teens and becomes obsessed with like he was very an early developer in terms of having some relatively and understanding some relative. And I mean, he's obviously completely au fait with the mathematics of his time. He's one of the greatest logicians of any time. I mean, he considered himself to be. He considered like Aristotle, Leibniz, and Duns Scotus to be his only peers in the history of logic. So he's funny because he combines this. There's a bit of arrogance there, obviously. I think there are probably a lot of people who might agree with some sort of, and he's very clear to say, I only mean in terms of logic. I don't mean in terms of anything else. These guys are all greater than me. Aristotle is far greater than me as a systematic metaphysician, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of logic, I'm his equal. But so there's this hubris on the one hand, but then there's also this, and these often go together, of course. This is a very Jungian kind of idea that the megalomania and the deep insecurity are two sides of the same coin.
And was he an alcoholic, or there was some drug use abuse
Yeah,
issue, right? So
Yeah,
maybe he had a few drinks when he said that or wrote that about himself, but
he was a bit of a dissolute individual in a lot of ways, and I don't know his biography super well, but he struggled, I think, throughout his life to feel part of any community. He felt apart, um, and by all accounts, that was self-inflicted, as it really often is.
Mhm.
But one of the things that he says all the time is that I'm not. He also says, despite having said what he says about being this peerless, almost peerless logician, that I'm not particularly brilliant. I'm not at all creative. I just happen to hit on a method at an early age. Um, and everything I'm saying is abundantly obvious to anybody who thinks it through. And even like William James, his good friend, is kind of saying, well, I don't know, you need to rewrite this stuff, Charles, to make it more approachable and stuff. And like I'm getting something from what you're saying, and it's really profound, and I know, but it's beyond me. It's incomprehensible. And Peirce just doesn't get it. He's like, no, this is just obvious. Just think. But there is a certain obviousness to some of this evolutionary reasoning. It certainly feels that way to me. But again, I can't get outside my perspective, and it's dangerous to think that such things are so obvious as well, because then that means that is a path into certain dogmatism. But just to finish the triad, because I keep waffling, and the thirdness then, or agapism, if we're getting into evolutionary love, that's basically selection, because selection is what creates generals, what creates purpose and goals and all of that. And those are the things that are characteristic of thirdness. Thirdness isn't just relation, in the sense that actually relation was his term for secondness originally, but he changed that to reaction, because it's a
Mhm.
certain kind of relation which is blind and brute. It's efficient.
Resistant.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's efficient causation, basically. It's things banging into each other, with no learning or no growth coming from it. Whereas thirdness he describes as mediation.
Mediation would be the better term. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, just on the historical point about James and Peirce and their relationship, I know James really went to great lengths to try to get Peirce a position teaching as a faculty member at Harvard, and for some reason the president of Harvard, who had known Peirce from at an earlier time, just didn't like him, and because he was a prickly, abrasive personality, um, and so yeah, he just struggled working for the U.S. Equivalent of the Geological Survey, like
Postal
working
survey.
the Coastal Survey, and just these odd jobs that he would do, which taught him a lot about the practicalities of making measurements and how to that gap that can exist between mathematics and the perfection of geometry versus having to make the measurement and the need for approximation when you do those sorts of translation between the mathematical uh, rational relations of mathematics and the real relations that you can start to uncover through measurement, even if there are higher truths that are there are real relations that we can discover through intuitive leaps that we then find later also apply to the natural world. But Whitehead actually wrote in a letter to Charles Sanders Peirce and Hartshorne. Um, sorry, he wrote in a letter to Hartshorne about Peirce, and Hartshorne had studied Peirce's papers when Whitehead had arrived at Harvard in the 1920s and early 30s, and Hartshorne introduced Whitehead to Peirce's later philosophical work, even if Whitehead actually cites one of Peirce's mathematical papers in his 1898 universal algebra text. But Whitehead wasn't familiar with his philosophy until Hartshorne, and having been introduced to Peirce, Whitehead first of all told Hartshorne, like, please promise that you'll say I am just reading this for the first time, because he was so struck by the convergence, he didn't want to be accused of plagiarizing. But also he said that, you know, even though the time isn't quite right, the time order isn't quite right, he identified James as really like the American Plato because of how suggestive but unsystematic
Mm.
his thought is, whereas Peirce was more like the American Aristotle. because he really is a systematic thinker. And it could be that Peirce wasn't as clear as he could be in his presentation of his ideas, and James had a point that, make this more approachable, so people can see your genius. But on the other hand, James isn't exactly a systematic, rigorous, logical or I mean, he's scientific in an empiricist sense. Like he really pays attention to his sensory experience, and he's a great anatomist and physiologist, but he's not a logician.
He's a firstness guy in many ways, right?
Sure. Yeah. 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 And Peirce has that too, but he's willing to, carry it forward and formalize it. And he's a master of diagrammatic modes of reasoning in algebra and geometry. And um, Whitehead shares that with him. But I think, you know, the distillation that Peirce achieves with this triadic logic, I think, is in some ways more impressive than what Whitehead's metaphysical achievement, because it's just far simpler.
Yeah.
And for that reason, more applicable.
Yeah. And the whole idea here, which again Peirce is very explicit about, is what I've taken to somewhat facetiously calling min-maxing as an approach to metaphysics. But it's what is the absolutely minimal postulate that you can make, from which you can essentially derive the maximum variety, the maximum. So one way of thinking about it, we've talked about Simondon and allegmatics in the past, and that's one of the reasons also to have recommended we start our collaborative engagement with Peirce with this essay, because what he's doing is he's defining the triad, and then he's mapping it onto all these distinct disciplines in sort of special sciences, at various levels of detail and whatever, and with maybe dubious levels of success at some points. But what he's engaging in is this analogical reasoning, which essentially is what, well, again, maybe we get to that. It's what mathematics is. It's what computation is, really. But he's doing it in this extremely fundamental way, where he's starting with this very, very basic, yes, triad, and basically trying to see if you can map every observable onto this scheme. And I'm like a leanness freak when it comes to metaphysics, as you know. I don't want, because I find a lot in common with Peirce here. I think there are ways that he violates his own strictures here, and if we get into the theology, maybe we'll talk about that. But into Peirce's more explicit theology. But I really think that as a fundamental posit, like if we're going to say that we need something that's kind of basically inexplicable, and Whitehead has this too, obviously, with his just creativity and the primordial nature of God and stuff, right? This is absolutely, inexplicable. But if we're going to start with that, we want to make that as like denuded, as impoverished, as bland and colorless as we possibly can. And that's why I have like my own personal rules against using certain words, which to me are just way too colorful for a primary. I just like the, firstness, secondness, thirdness. And then you can map whatever at some higher level and some more colorful. I don't want to drain the color from reality at all. That's part of what having the three universes that Peirce has. Again, Peirce kind of has these three universes, which are three stances, really, three perspectives that you can take on any observable, like from the perspective of firstness, which then would be his phaneroscopy, whatever, phenomenology, the universe of inquiry, which is basically science, and that's corresponding to secondness in the sense that science is efficient cause dominated, and then thirdness is a kind of the speculative, and what grounds the speculative is this minimal posit, because the speculative is where you try to get the explanation from, in some sense. Like that's the fundamental explanatory stance that you take, whereas the other two are much more descriptive in a sense, right? And of course, again, these are idealizations. Each of them feeds back onto each other, and I'm certainly never going to say that there's no explanation in science. I think ultimately science is all about our desire for explanation, but what the methods of science are particularly good at is extremely rigorous and as precise as possible descriptions. And then we bring in speculative hypotheses that are, again, in a very much a dialectical relationship with those very precise descriptions, of course. And Peirce is very, very clear on that as well. You have to be in correspondence with he is a scientist, and again, that's what makes Peirce such an attractive figure. And I think Whitehead is very similar. And I really enjoy James, and I enjoy tons of different philosophers, and they often are very much specialists in kind of one of these universes, so to speak, right? They take Peirce, Whitehead, James. I get it right the third time. Everything comes in threes. James, he's this radical empiricist, right? So he's this incredibly good at phenomenology or phaneroscopy or whatever, and that's his emphasis. Peirce is a much more balanced thinker. He's a much more complete thinker in that sense, and I think that's the case with Whitehead as well, because these guys are hardcore empiricists, but they also have the deep familiarity with the science and the methods of science. Of course, all of the methods of formal modeling. They're both heavy-hitting, mathematicians and logicians, but then they're also willing to do the speculative metaphysics thing. And so, most people we find who are, really like highly developed on the formal side of things are often quite dismissive of speculative metaphysics, right? Or they might be dismissive of firstness, of the phaneroscopic approach as too subject to delusion and whatever. Oh, that's all illusion, and they thereby, they become specialists, right? And there's a great virtue to that as well. But there's a virtue to these generalists who have the capacity to vie with the specialists in any of those given domains, and that's pretty rare, obviously.
Yeah. It's a shame that Peirce, while he may have been a more well-rounded thinker, he didn't seem, at least from what I've read, to be a more well-rounded personality. Whereas William James was such a gregarious, sociable person. Whitehead never met him, but referred to him as an adorable genius. And so a much better communicator, and able to move through social reality in quite a fluid way, whereas Peirce just was unable to do so. And so there's just a paradox there. And Whitehead was maybe not as charismatic as James, but was still well loved by his students. And
maybe this fits in the sense, sorry to interrupt, but maybe this fits in the sense that, social reality is, and being present with your interlocutors, that's kind of an orientation towards firstness. And that's what people really enjoy in an interlocutor, right? Is feeling seen, feeling like this person's really listening, really paying attention, and really responsive. And Peirce is too much in the world of secondness and thirdness, in some sense, to be present. And as that kind of synthetic systematic thinker, I think he just feels kind of alienated from everyone who's not really doing that to the same extent as he is.
Yeah, no, it can't be easy to be at that level where these really deep truths are obvious to you and nobody else seems to be able to notice. So I don't want to just abruptly transition straight into the theology, but maybe arrive there by way of a question for you, which is like, I know you like the minimalism of Peirce, like say in contrast to Whitehead's more elaborate approach with just 8 categories of existence and 27 categories of explanation and on and on. Peirce has a leaner set of metaphysical equipment that does a lot of the work. His categories are evident in Whitehead's scheme. There's no easy one-to-one translation. I don't think that's even the right approach to try to take, to say like map a firstness to one of Whitehead's concepts and etc. Um, but I wonder for you, it sounds like so far you're more comfortable with the Peircean approach here. It doesn't, I mean, there's the theological side of it, and we'll get there, but because, Peirce lays out these different options, right? Um, these different views that he associates uh, when he develops this analogy about measuring an infinite line, and the way we think about the two beginning and ending points of that line
Mm.
sort of reveals our underlying metaphysical position. Um, so he lays out the Epicurian view, the pessimist view, and the evolutionist view, and he has a rather interesting view of the evolutionist, which may be carrying some theological baggage that you might want to leave behind. But just to lay that out a little bit more, when he develops this analogy, which was one of my favorite parts of this essay, uh, right, about this infinite iron bar that we're trying to measure with a yardstick. And if we think that we can say that the absolute first is the beginning of this line, he calls it God the creator. It's the
Mm.
origin.
Mm.
It's the pure potentiality from which everything springs. And then the opposite line is the absolute second, right? It's the ultimate terminus, and he calls it God completely revealed.
Mm.
It's the fully actualized state of the universe. And then thirdness becomes anywhere we measure along this line. It's
Mm.
inherently relative in that sense. It's history between the alpha and the omega. Uh,
Mm.
because then he goes on then to offer these three different interpretations of the nature of these points, and he says the Epicurean view would be the one that says that only thirdness is real. Those two points are imaginary. Um, the second would be the pessimist view, where you say it's cyclical. Those 2 points are coincident. They
Mm.
actually end up being the same line. Um, and this is where you think, as he puts it, there's no real progress to be made in reality. There's just a sort of dissolution into nirvana. It's a cynical view of reality. And then his view is this evolutionist view, where he thinks there's some kind of absolute distinction between the origin, firstness, and the terminus, secondness. That something real is accomplished, something is achieved, something different is achieved in the distant future than from where the universe began. And for him, he says that this evolutionary view is essentially the same as that of Christian theology, which is quite interesting. Now, one doesn't need to make that move, but for Peirce, it's not just, many people in his time thought, oh, wow, evolution and Christianity are totally incompatible. And he's like, no, actually, there's a deep symmetry here. If you're going to be a Christian, you might actually want to look again at this evolutionist view, because it aligns quite strikingly with your sense that there's a historical process unfolding here, and that real novelty is being introduced, such that a whole new understanding of miracles can spring from this idea of a habit taking process, where laws of nature are not fixed and deterministic, but that chance and repetition uh, and selection can give rise to some very unexpected um, capacities, right? And so the universe has this arc to it, this telos to it. So yeah, I just wonder, given his full theological interpretation of his stripped down metaphysics, like where are you on the train, and where do you get off the train?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. This is a very big question, and I have. I mean, I have a lot to say on the subject, but I try to respond to what you've said specifically, in a few ways. So I think one thing, there are places where Peirce is making analogies. So he's speaking poetically as well. And he does tell us that, you know, our image of the infinite, you know, the time in the infinite past, which is the absolute, well, the absolute origin, if you want, but there's a reason not to say it that way as well, because it's real but inexistent. It doesn't exist, right? That's not an actual state of affairs. It's not an actual, yeah. And similarly, the time in the absolute, you know, infinite future. So there's this idealized continuum, which is the passage from basically absolute indetermination, absolute indeterminacy, to absolute determination, which is a universe of pure inertia. So he thinks that like his endpoint, his idealized endpoint, is the world, in fact, of pure secondness, is the world of you know, mechanical determinism. It's a universe of pure inertia. It's dead. He's very clear. This is the death. And I like to think of it as a fossilized universe in a way, right? Because what's there, the structure that is there is the fossilized remnants of this process of active formation, which is what's going on in the actual history of the universe. And that is, Peirce is a vitalist, let's be clear. So that is living, when the universe is alive, it's creative, it's doing this active formation thing. That's Rouillet's term, right? Raymond Rouillet's term. And also that is the operation of mind. You know, that's what Peirce means by mind with a capital M, is really this creative evolution, this capacity to learn, this capacity to generate novelty. So he's got this image, and sometimes he analogizes, and he speaks poetically, and he says that the absolute firstness, we can't speak about that. Like, it's very appropriate to speak about that in the terms that are in the book of Genesis, for example, and we shouldn't try to speak any more precisely about it than that, because it can't be spoken about precisely. And this is a general principle about firstness as well, right? That when you're speaking about firstness, or you're in thirdness, basically, you can't actually speak of thirdness. You know, you can't even think articulately of it. When you think articulately of it, it's gone. You know, remember that anything, he says something like, remember that anything you say of it will never be faithful to it, or whatever. There's a although, you know, I have this ongoing debate with a Peircean friend about whether or not this is a kind of principle of ineffability or unsayability, and whether it maps onto something like Alfred Korzybski saying, you know, whatever I say a thing is, it is not. I think it does map onto that. I think there is a trace of a kind of negative theology in Peirce, but there are those who would deny that, and they know more about Peirce than I do. So, but I will maintain my point of view regardless, stubbornly, until I, you know, proven otherwise. And I find Peirce to be in conflict with himself at certain points as well, like any expansive thinker is going to be. I'm trying to get to the point. I'm trying to get to the theology. So there are times at which he's making analogies, and I think that in the passage that you've read, you know, that is God the Creator, and that is God the fully revealed. In a sense, he's giving us a poetic description of these idealized, you know, pure firstness and pure secondness. And then, yeah, he totally says that this evolutionist view is essentially the Christian view, and he goes harder and harder on this as later in life, basically, and as he develops his evolutionary cosmology, which is what he's, you know, he's a big part of what he's doing in the last sort of, I don't know, 20 years of his life. He's also actually finding God in his personal life, and he's finding you know, we discussed him being this irascible individual who found it very difficult to fit into any community, and basically had a very difficult life, and, you know, was unable to fund his projects often, you know, was quite poor, was unwell, had issues with alcohol and other drug abuse, etc. And he does find solace in Christianity later in life, like in the notion of a personal God. But, you know, when we see him analogizing this evolutionary picture to Christianity, we should also remember that is it in Evolutionary Love, or maybe it's in Cynicism, Fallibilism, and Evolution? But in another essay, he says that Aristotle is just evolutionary, metaphysics as well, right? So he doesn't say that this is, originates with Christianity. Of course, Aristotle has his God too, right? But the metaphysician's God, which Whitehead will make a lot of. But he is saying this is a general form, a general way, and this is his whole shtick, basically. Like, this is the most general way to think. And Peirce isn't, so far as I know, particularly good on like comparative mythology or whatever. But that I would say, find me a creation myth that isn't evolutionary. Find me like, this is a generic way to think about the world. And we do go through these weird periods. And maybe, I said recently on Twitter that they kind of reached their apotheosis in a certain sense in the 20th century, ironically, given the rise of contemporary evolutionary biology, but where we get this really mechanical clockwork anti-evolutionary picture. But at least implicitly, the evolutionary picture is the standard view. So yeah, Christianity is an example of that. And Peirce, of course, makes a lot of that example because of the culture that he grows up in, and also because of what he finds personally in that later in life. So there's all that to say, and I've said a lot. There's a lot to say, much more to say about things where he, like, what's the concept of God to Peirce? Peirce will say that if you spend time with a great thinker, if you spend time reading the works of Aristotle, or just in the company of some great person, then they are something of their behavior, something of their character, something of their mind rubs off on you in a way that then goes on to inform your conduct and behavior. So you develop a deep kind of resonance with these great minds. When you can contemplate physical reality, when you contemplate actual, the actual cosmos, it has a similar effect on you. And that is you rubbing up against the mind of God, basically, right? So in the same way that, this is the analogy that he makes. He's also quick to say that saying that God has a mind is a kind of, he says, ludicrously figurative at one point, way of putting it. It's like some artist drawing God up in the clouds and, blah, blah, blah. And that would be, and I'll stop talking now, but we can continue to develop this if you want, but that's where I start with my critique of his later arguments about the reality of God. But God is again, it's kind of like Whitehead in the sense that it is this minimal metaphysician's God. It's a kind of Spinozistic God, maybe we could say, to some degree. It's basically, God is the order of nature, that there is an order to nature. That's God, to Peirce. But he does kind of get into a personalistic God to some degree. And this is what I think of as the last thing I'll say, just as a teaser. Again, we don't need to go there. To me, that's the God of prosaic reality. And for me, God is banished in my scheme, my Peircean scheme, which is just one of my schemes. God is only allowed to exist kind of in firstness. So I have these strictures for like speculative hypotheses. You can't have God because God is just too inexplicable there, and it's too colorful as well. It's not an impoverished enough concept. We've talked about this before, but I of course wouldn't want to deny the experience of God, but I would also remind Peirce and others that if this is a God that inhabits firstness, that is a God of direct experience, even the word God strictly does not refer, right? Because nothing strictly refers to direct experience. So that would be part of the way that I wriggle through this terrain and have my own strictures, where I don't want to be, again, I don't want to be denying that this sense that people have, that we might have, that comes through a kind of contemplation of the mind of God or the works of God, the order of, but it's strictly a kind of firstness to me, Like it can't be erected as an explanatory principle. And I love what you said in one of our exchanges on this. You said, I don't believe in a creator God, I believe in a relator God. And I think that that's quite consistent with what I'm saying. I just kind of go further down the via negativa, and I'm basically like, yeah, but the term God, especially with a capital G and all that, strictly does not refer to that relator God, because that's just an experience. And as soon as you dress it up, so I'm going on and on, sorry, but I bring Peirce's principle of diagrammatization and the idea of stripping ideas of their garb. These are just sort of direct allusions to things that Peirce says, in order to to make the relationships themselves more definite, which is basically what Poincaré says is mathematics. It's basically what Whitehead says is mathematics in his introduction to mathematics as well. That's diagrammatization. And so I say, yeah, you apply that, like God is a function in these explanatory schemes, and God is a function or an operation that you can have a kind of direct contact with by contemplating, again, the order of nature and all of that. But when you're in the diagrammatic mode, so when you're in the speculative, analogical, allegmatic, etc. mode, you want to strip. I want to strip that garb down to those relations and not give them colorful names, basically, because that obscures the relations in a certain sense, right?
I mean, it's certainly a contested term that has a history of use that might, in different cultural contexts, suggest exactly the wrong idea. And that creator-relator distinction is important. But I think I'm not ready to cede the territory. I mean, usually the word God is defined as like the highest idea we could have. But maybe what Peirce is getting at when he says, look, I'm just saying everything that's obvious. And when Whitehead defines metaphysics as an analysis of the obvious, I mean, maybe when they use God, they're trying to make it so common, and literally God
Yeah.
as what is common, what is most common. So instead of it being the highest, most difficult thing to reach or whatever, it's actually what we all already share and presuppose. And so whether we render that in terms of evolutionary love as the kind of, or the agapic tendency of the whole evolutionary process, um, or we think of this in terms of what mediates between possibility and actuality. And I think Peirce and Whitehead both have a sense of God as a mediator of possibilities. And then there's this idea of, when Peirce talks about truth, it's like the ideal of truth is that some community of inquirers in the distant future might converge upon this vision. That's another way of thinking about the divine. But it's a very relational way of thinking about it, and it's elaborated in a beautiful way by another friend of James's. And I don't know. I guess he must have met Peirce as well. He certainly was influenced by him. Josiah Royce,
Oh yeah.
um, who develops this whole logic of community.
I mean,
Uh,
Josiah Royce, Peirce describes him as, well, maybe he doesn't quite get there. He kind of says that I have no students, but Josiah Royce is generally considered like the one guy who really got Peirce. Yeah, so he was definitely very influenced by him. Yeah.
mm.
Yeah. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
And just in the context of a community striving to realize truth, the concept of God, the word God,
Mm.
even, I think serves a function that's potentially, I mean, it might be irreplaceable. I mean, we can come up with some other
Yeah.
numinously charged word if we don't like the old one, but
Yeah. Look,
uh,
I'm not really in disagreement with any of that. In fact, I'm in pretty profound agreement, I think, with a lot of that, and it's certainly not any objection. I mean, obviously, I have objection to some of the functions and operations that some notions of God are, allegedly fulfill. But
like the
there are,
creator God.
yeah, yeah, but there are these classical, probably with a big C, traditional with a big T, functions that God fulfills, and there are a whole bunch of them that I recognize and kind of endorse. I am just leery of the name, and at least I've come up with, which I haven't fully articulated now, and we don't need to. Maybe if we read something like a neglected argument for the reality of God, another Peirce essay, and his concept of God for that matter. We could go more into my kind of quasi-Peircean mosaic and how I try to restrict the kind of spreading of the God function out of the prosaic across the whole mosaic, and what my reasons are for doing that. And that's just an exercise. That's just something that that's just a way that I'm differentiating my own thought by constructing systems. It's not like this is my system or something, and I'm certainly not. I can see a lot of reasons to preserve the term God for some of the functions or ideals that you're mentioning. So I'm not sort of deaf to those. And it may be that I'll come around to that in a certain sense. And I mean, part of it is like, who do you want to talk to? Who are you trying to bring into the fold to some degree? But
Right.
God is this very polarizing term. So you are, by using it, you're bringing some people into the fold and, probably pushing others out. And that's part of why I'm handling it with kid gloves, and I'm seeing how I might restrict it kind of systematically, almost formally, to certain regions of reality. But I like what you said about, this is not exactly what you said, but trivializing God, making God a triviality.
Yeah.
That's exactly
A
was my,
commonality. Yeah,
yeah, but I like to say it this way because it's more provocative.
yeah.
That was exactly my approach some years ago to evolution. And I mean, in a sense, it's still in my approach, but is just to trivialize it in the sense
Whitehead
that it's,
says secularize it too. I mean, I think it's another way of getting at the same
yeah,
sort
yeah,
of
yeah. But
thing.
I like to say trivialize.
Okay,
But
fine.
it's like I even want to debase my favorite ideas in some sense. It's like like evolution shouldn't be at all threatening. It's completely trivial and just observable in like all. It's just a straightforward thing. What we do with that idea is different, but as a kind of another version of it, and I mean it's the same as the Peirce's 1, 2, 3 is just a logicization of evolution, as exactly again we see in Lewontin's diagramming of Darwinian evolution, the exact same triad, right? I'm not sure to what degree Lewontin was actually directly influenced by Peirce, but yeah, evolution is just to me like just a basic posit in that sense. So I try to short circuit, some of the arguments against evolution. To me, that's just silly. Yes, against all sorts of theories that try to account for evolution, against emphasis on one mechanism or one form of process. But evolution is just process. It's just constrained change. Like it's like nobody can. I mean, yeah, there are ways of denying it. Like I guess a universe of pure secondness or block
So,
universe.
so here's
Um,
another question for you. Peirce's sense of firstness as involving immediate feeling. For him, the evolutionary process presupposes feeling.
hmm.
Feeling is not a trait that emerges later on through some mutational selection process. No, it's built in, and what allows evolution, what allows habits to occur, uh, is only that there is a kind of primordial sensitivity. There's a yeah, a feeling, a pan feelingism, a pan sensualism, whatever. So it's, I don't know if we want to call it panpsychist. We probably don't. I don't want to upset you, but there's clearly, I mean, you said mind first earlier that for Peirce, he's an objective idealist. Um, what do you make of this aspect of his ontology, that if this triad goes all the way down, that means on some level there is experience, there is a habit taking tendency already with molecules, already with atoms, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like fully on board with that. It's like I don't have these objections to Whitehead either in terms of again, the diagram, the structure, the operations in the thought. I'm really very comfortable with those, and I don't see, like you, I'm dissatisfied. I do think life is special in a sense, I mean, there are ways you can justify that claim, but I mean, I'm basically a vitalist. I'm basically a vitalist animist, which to me is just process relationism, which is just, evo eco, these are just those are generic principles to me. So yes, of course, there's a responsivity. Um, there's a fundamental relationality in and that is required for determinate forms to evolve. So call it feeling if you want, call it experience. I mean, yeah, so Whitehead has a very beautiful definition of a generalization of the term experience. Peirce has the same, like I read to you a second ago. Peirce is a pan-experientialist, in a pretty by experience must be understood the entire mental product. The cosmos is the mental product. Yeah. So because this operation, this evolutionary process, that's the operation of mind, to the extent, and it's life, to the extent that it is in any sense generative or creative. So it's only when we reach the universe, and we never do because it's not an existent state, but there's an idealization, an idealized pole in the distant future, the universe of pure inertia. That's the dead universe. But that is the product of mind. It's just there is no mind operative anymore. And I mean, Peirce also, one of my issue with panpsychism as a sort of substance property version of panpsychism is really the same as yours. And Peirce says, exactly refutes that view. So he talks about theological, so more like creationist thinkers and their objection to atomism, right? Their objection to the idea that atoms are fundamental. And he says these creationist thinkers do not perceive that which offends them. That which offends them is not the firstness in the swerving atoms. So the idea that atoms are themselves somehow creative, because they themselves are just as much advocates of firstness as the ancient atomists were. But what they cannot accept is the attribution of this firstness to things perfectly dead and material. So they don't object to atoms being creative, he's saying. They object to them being dead. And now I am quite with them there. I think too that whatever is first is ipso facto sentient. Sentient, he even says, right? I mean, sometimes people are loose with words, in my opinion, right? I wouldn't use that word that way, right? But okay, if I make atoms swerve, as I do, I make them swerve, but very, very little, because I conceive they are not absolutely dead. He's a vitalist. And by that, here we go. By that, I do not mean exactly that I hold them to be physically such as the materialists hold them to be, only with a small dose of sentiency superadded. That's substance property panpsychism. For that, I grant would be feeble enough. What I mean is that all that there is first feelings, second efforts, third habits, all of which are more familiar to us on their psychical side than on their physical side, and that dead matter would merely be the final result of the complete induration of habit, so absolute habit, absolute inheritance, right? Absolute secondness, reducing the free play of feeling and the brute irrationality of effort to complete death. Right. So and
This is why I'm always, it sounds absurd when you first hear it, but this is why I've tried to articulate in various forms the argument that life, like dead matter presupposes life. Life always comes before dead matter, right? Just as firstness comes before secondness. And I like the feebleness. So there's a feeble substance panpsychism, and there's more robust Peircean Whiteheadian view, where it's not just consciousness superadded to a material substance.
I have no objection to it. You see, I'm going to choose to use words in a certain way myself. I think it's important. So this was a challenge that I had in my recent chat with Levin Fields and Friston, and it will be an ongoing challenge in my interactions with that group of thinkers who I deeply admire. That they have, well, Mike articulated such a kind of pragmatist, but I think Peirce himself would object. So
instrumentalist might be the better word for it.
I suppose, yeah. But view of the use of language,
which was Dewey's word. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. View of the use of language. Like, oh, it's all metaphor. So it almost doesn't matter what metaphors I choose. It only matters if this metaphor reveals something. And I don't mind the play with language. It's a difficult one to pin down, right? But you can easily do a reductio ad absurdum. Like if I'll make it just super silly. If I said the free energy principle was a banana split sundae, you would be like, hang on, I'm not sure that's a useful metaphor, And maybe I could then give you an elaborate, justification of the choice of that metaphor. But having presented that to you without that elaborate justification, you'd probably initially be going like, hang on, this is just confusing me. Like, what is this actually revealing to me? And so there are always going to be limits. And this is all I was able to say in response to Mike in that conversation. We're all going to agree that there are limits. We're all going to agree that words don't have intrinsic meaning. We're not essentialists about definition. We're not doing, we're not committing Whitehead's fallacy of the perfect dictionary here. So we're not ordinary language philosophers in the sense that cannot be our fundamental principle of reasoning. But we're still all going to agree that it's kind of important to have a shared set of meanings, which you're never going to, my mind doesn't map onto your mind or whatever, or Peirce's or Whitehead's precisely, but I know what they mean. And that's the important thing. And so then I'm going to choose, and I'm not settled, like I'm very unsettled about these things. So, but I'm going to choose in a certain context to use a word in a certain way. And probably if it's any kind of, quasi-scholarly or academic or whatever context, or this kind of context, if I'm going to use the word as a positive term in my thinking when I'm trying to articulate it, I probably will need to provide I'll need to stipulate a definition for that word that is appropriate to this time and place to avoid misconceptions. And so I feel like I've studied, Peirce and Whitehead, but just the structure of evolutionary thought, to the degree where I understand the operations, I understand the diagram of the thought pretty well. And then there is a sense in which it doesn't matter all that much what terms are used to dress it up. But then it does matter when one tries to communicate that to others. So there's an interpretation, and I mean, you've obviously done great amount of work in the interpretation of Whitehead for people who are not Whiteheadians or people who haven't studied the structure of the thought that underpins Whitehead's thought, and that's an incredibly important job. And one needs to do that with Peirce. What does Peirce actually mean by mind, such that he can say that something like experience is the totality of the mental product, or that mind comes first, that he's an objective idealist, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, we all need to struggle against becoming Whiteheadians or Peirceans or whatever, because, as philosophers, and, Wittgenstein saw this, like we can get stuck in certain language games, and certain lineages of preferred discourse. And when we're dealing with symbols in Peirce's sense, there's a certain conventionality of meaning, and it is somewhat arbitrary. But what Peirce allows us to see is that that meaning has this triadic structure. There's symbols, but there's also indexes and icons. And so there's, even in our alphabetic languages and the definitions of words, there's a history of use, and there's etymology, and there's a sense in which some words are onomatopoeic and do have this iconicity about them, right? And simple words are indexical. And so when we think about the conveyance of meaning, we don't want to totally just accept this, Saussurian structuralist idea that it's all completely arbitrary. And, Saussure, of course, has this binary understanding of signs, and Peirce gives us this more triadic relationship, which restores realism. We can break out of the linguistic enclosure and actually touch the world and see how language isn't just pure convention. And that we could get back in touch with reality here. And yes, we need to do this translation work, but at the end of the day, it's not about all arriving at the same agreed upon way of speaking. That would be boring as hell and oppressive and make us all very stupid. And so we need to be, constantly struggling with these mouth noises. It gets absurd when you step back, because I try to listen to conversations when two physicists are talking to each other about the arcana of the math of particle physics, and I'm just like, they may as well be talking nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But they clearly understand each other, and that community of discourse understands what they're saying. And in physics, because of, I guess, the institutional structure and the weight of certain crucial experiments, there's a convergence upon a certain way of formulating a situation, and everyone agrees to speak in those terms and to use the symbols of the equations that describe that situation. Whereas in philosophy, because the questions we're dealing with are far more abstract in a sense, we have no experiments to perform, at least, but
embrace vagueness. Peirce
and
would
vagueness, yeah,
have us embrace the vagueness of language there.
exactly
For sure.
where I was going. Yeah, and so the vagueness of symbolic language is both its great power and what makes it so fragile.
Yeah, because it's got that taikik, that chancy aspect that's required for generativity. For if we go Deleuzian for a second, philosophy, and I'm loving what you were saying, because philosophy is a heterogenetic exercise. It's not just, Deleuze would say, not just philosophy of heterogenesis, which would be like kind of evolutionary thought, although that Deleuze would take exceptions with evolutionism because he would identify it with a particular 19th century form. But it's not just a philosophy of heterogenesis, but a heterogenesis, philosophy as heterogenesis. So it's always about differentiating yourself, not becoming a Whiteheadian, not becoming a Peircean, always about differentiating our thought in that way. And so that's part of what I'm just doing by resisting some of these terms, to be honest, or just saying, okay, I'm happy to use it, and I believe I get what they mean, and I love the thing that they're articulating, but at the same time I want to maintain a certain kind of critical distance, and I want to be like, these are some of the points in the thought which I would choose to poke at and perturb, not because I think I'm going to do it better. That's not what it's about either. It's not about achieving some kind of ultimate final explanation. Peirce will speak again fallibilistically of that there should be no particular fact which we consider ultimate and inexplicable. So we look for an explanation of any particular fact, but never an explanation of all facts, never the ultimate general. Because even like that might seem to be at odds with the idea of this generalizing in metaphysics, but this is a mistake to think of firstness, secondness, and thirdness as a reductive paradigm. Like speculative metaphysics is not about reduction at all. It's the opposite. It's about what can you generate from this thing. Like firstness, secondness, and thirdness in itself cannot explain any particular. So that there's all this particularity in the world, and this is also, just as an aside, and I think we could get into some analogies with things like the free energy principle. This is a way to misunderstand that kind of research program as well. And I don't say that perhaps members of that research program or whatever haven't misunderstood it in this way at times or whatever. Like whatever. To me, it's not reductionist in the slightest. It's allegmatic. It's analogical. It's like when in this essay Peirce jumps from psychology to physiology. This is not a reductive move. This is not a move to reduce psychology to physiology in any sense whatsoever. Peirce is not a reductionist of any kind, like in any sense. It's an allegmatic, it's an analogical move. It's a, okay, so I've shown that these structures exist, this or this, these operations, in fact, of firstness, secondness, and thirdness exist in psychology. And now I will show that these same patterns are manifest in physiology. Not that I'm reducing again. I'm mapping across. And something like the free energy principle as a kind of fundamental set of physical constraints that anything must be in, like coherent with, in order to persist over time, which is this completely tautological thing that Peirce has, by the way, an exact articulation of this in here, which I will find. We'll get to that. Yeah, it's can we then look at all of these different, if we're thinking of it as a scale free or scale invariant principle, can we then look at all these different levels of description or all these different scales, different temporal scales, different spatial scales, etc., and can we then find the manifestation of this structuring set of constraints within that? It's not, can we reduce it and just say this is nothing but that? Not at all. It's got all this particularity. It's irreducible because it's got firstness, and firstness is irreducible. For, like, again, Peirce will say of feeling that it cannot resemble anything else.
See, that's why. So this is helping me understand my somewhat fraught relationship with FEP. So if free energy, if the free energy principle or the Bayesian brain or active inference is put forward as an explanation for why there's consciousness or what consciousness is, I don't buy it at all. But if it presupposes firstness, then it is a wonderful way of describing what a thing needs to do to remain the thing that it is, at whatever scale or complexity, whether we're talking about a rock or a cell or a human being. But part of, the input output, the sensory and the active aspects of the model, that's when Peirce talks about firstness and secondness, like these are the feeling of the immediate moment is not explained by that model, it's presupposed by it.
Yeah.
Right.
And it is not a representation, and it cannot be represented. It doesn't partake of resemblance in any sense. It's just is. That's what firstness is. It's the thing that is itself in virtue of itself and nothing else, basically. And again, it's an operation, an operational definition, in the sense that doesn't mean that we couldn't attempt to describe processes leading to, like, processes in the nervous system or whatever that have as their correlate some perception or other, but it's not about reducing them to that, because they have this irreducible quality of firstness to them. So even though we can, and again, whenever we describe or attempt to explain a firstness, we're already in the domain of thirdness. We're not firstness just is in this sense. But you can look at any bare particular and treat it as a first. That's a stance that you can take towards any bare particular. You could also treat it as something else. You could enter into a secondness. You could think about the efficient causes that led to its particular appearance, and that it might itself act as an efficient cause. All of and then you can think about it in evolutionary terms, historical terms, in terms of thirdness. What's its purpose? Does it have a function? All of that. And we get worried, like functionalism as some arch reductionism or something like that. No, that's just a way of looking at that's a way of framing a thing which can teach us something about it, that treating it as a bare particular will never teach us about it. But it doesn't reduce or obviate or eliminate. It's not eliminative in any sense. It doesn't eliminate the fact that it is a firstness. It's just difference. This is aspectualism, right? This is, or perspectivalism. But I'd say aspectualism describes, like, 1, 2, 3, the three logical universes, and perspectives are more fine-grained perspectives within those. So like your perspective on a when you take this the stance of thirdness towards something, it's not going to be the same as the stance of thirdness that I'm going to take towards something, or that a snail or whatever. So, when you we all have different perspectives, but again, there's a realism here. There's an actual thing that we're taking a perspective on. We can take different kinds of perspectives. Logically, Peirce says there are 3 different perspectives we can take. So these are the 3 logical aspects of the thing. And then, but perspectives themselves, ultimately, as a principle of firstness, exist as bare particulars. So everyone has a particular perspective, and my perspective is also changing all the time. And it resembles nothing. It's not a representation. All of those principles apply. One thing you said that I wanted to just quickly loop back to, and this is again taking the perspective of thirdness, I think. So the evolutionary, explanatory, purposive, etc. kind of perspective on things. You said words are not just conventions, which is right, but I think a key here, and Peirce would not use this language, but is that Peirce and these kinds of thoroughgoing evolutionary metaphysicians, so Whitehead for sure, but also someone like Popper and whatever, they give us a deep account of convention, because in a very important sense, the laws of physics are conventions of the cosmos, right? So there's a term that I would one of the things about
so conventions are not just arbitrary, in other words, like, because
exactly.
These are habits.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the problem is not, again, to think of meaning as conventional. It's conventional as fuck, but that doesn't mean that it's totally arbitrary. It's very constrained by context, and that context has both just like all context in biology, but just like all context in evolutionary ecological thinking, it has a synchronic ecological aspect to it. Who am I talking to? What's the community of inquirers? What's the discourse that I'm involved in at this particular moment? And then it has this deep diachronic aspect to it. What is the historical grounding of that context? So, words are conventional, but so is everything else.
So I want to go back to the question of feeling, and to what extent Peirce is he calls himself an objective idealist, but there's some sense in which, by making firstness primal, feeling is rooted at the very origin of anything. And this is related to his doctrine of cynicism as well, and continuity. And there's a little section of William James's Principles of Psychology, which comes out a few years after this essay. And no doubt, he had been reading Peirce on continuity before this, but he's specifically thinking about this principle of continuity in his account of evolution. And he talks about how he finds it incredible that the brain ever could have evolved unless there was already some minimal consciousness embedded in the process of evolution from the beginning. And so he ends up saying, he's wanting to avoid discontinuity in the evolutionary process, right? Where consciousness would just appear at some point when the brain got complex enough or something. He says the quantity of mind or consciousness or feeling in Peirce's sense is, consciousness isn't the wrong word, but that's the word James is choosing to use here. The quantity of consciousness is quite immaterial. This is a funny line. The girl in Midshipman Easy, which was a popular play at the time, who was pregnant, could not excuse the illegitimacy of her child by saying it was a very small one. Consciousness, however small, is an illegitimate birth in any philosophy that starts without it, and yet professes to explain all the facts by continuous evolution. If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things. And here he's exploring what he calls, in this context, the mind dust theory. He's not himself affirming this position. He's taking it seriously. He ends up discovering the so-called combination problem here, where, well, how do these little atoms of consciousness form a larger consciousness. But he actually proposes a solution to that problem that I think Whitehead elaborates on. And so, here I think he's making the argument that following Peirce's cynicism, what my version of the process version of panpsychism follows. And so is this just a wording problem, or
Well, there's definitely a big wording problem there, which you
the
even
choice
pointed
of
out.
consciousness is
Yeah, yeah.
problematic?
A couple of things to say. I mean, I think, and I never would want you to think otherwise, that you've done very important rhetorical work by inserting the Whiteheadian panpsychism into the discourse, right? But I think we should recognize, I think you do recognize that calling it panpsychism is a rhetorical move, in like in an important way, right?
So
Of
would
course.
calling it idealism, I mean, whatever choice we should make is going
Totally,
to be.
exactly. So on the one hand, Peirce does say, I just really, I'm very pleased I was quickly able to find this in Cynicism, Fallibilism, and Evolution. So he says the cynicus will not believe that some things are conscious and some unconscious unless by consciousness be meant a certain grade of feeling. He gives us immediately there the possibility, in fact, that some things are conscious and some things are unconscious, if it's a grade of feeling, which is very consistent with the way Whitehead treats consciousness, right, as a word, in the sense that Whitehead doesn't think consciousness is ubiquitous. Yeah.
And James, I mean, the section a few pages away from what I just read in James's Principles of Psychology is called "Can States of Mind Be Unconscious?"
Yeah. So all of these guys, and this I think is a really interesting historical point that I would love to delve into more, but none of them were unaware. Obviously, James wasn't unaware. Whitehead couldn't have failed to have been aware, especially given his, slightly later period of work, of the discovery of the unconscious in psychology, basically. And I don't necessarily mean Freud, but Freud is a big figure there. But Peirce specifically refers to having read Eduard von Hartmann and his philosophy of the unconscious, right? And this was like this incredibly, it's like 1860s or something, incredibly widely read by all, right-minded people, no, but like, intellectuals or whatever, obviously it's but popular, it's kind of like popular science, popular philosophy books, it's a number of volumes, it's like big, of its day. And Peirce specifically refers to the fact that much of mind, so when Peirce is saying mind first, cosmologically speaking, that this process of active formation, of learning, of creative evolution, etc., is mind. I was going to say it's a manifestation of mind. Yeah, I mean, I guess you can put it that way, but it is mind. He's explicitly not talking about consciousness. And he says that much of the mental, as Eduard von Hartmann has proven, I think he even says, is not conscious, and in fact, consciousness would be a positive hindrance to a lot of the actions of mind, basically. So, mind and consciousness are very much not coextensive. And so one of the issues with that I think exists, and again, I'm not like, defining a perfect dictionary here, but one of the issues I think with terms like even feeling and experience, and again, these guys define them fairly rigorously. So as just like when you're listening to, physicists and their domain-specific jargon, the Whiteheadian domain-specific jargon is fine within that domain, right? But those words to humans, readers, who are not humans, as opposed to the inhuman Whiteheadians, like the general populace, they do have a strong implication of subjectivity to them. And again, we get to find subjectivity in different ways too, but of what its likeness. And I have like a big bee in my bonnet about that whole lineage of recent philosophy, from what it's like from Nagel to Chalmers, and thence to contemporary panpsychism. That's the lineage I think that the dominant form of panpsychism is in. And I think there are all sorts of reasons, and I think our favorite guys and girls would reject that line of that. See,
lineage. My panpsychist lineage is Leibniz, Schelling, Bruno, Leibniz, Schelling, Peirce, Teilhard,
These
Bergson,
guys are
Whitehead.
all pretty much these guys. I mean, they're all different things, right? But you can call them vitalists, you can call them animists,
Sure.
you can. I'm again. What's the function of like inserting oneself into the discourse with there's a rhetorical function of choosing certain labels for a
My
position.
lineage is older. Mine's more
I agree.
original.
I'm on your side. But my own intervention, if I were so inclined as to make strong interventions into that discourse, and maybe, I don't know, I kind of got bored of the whole consciousness thing a while ago, but I mean, it's still a fascinating issue, but I mean, I got bored of that discourse. Having never been, let's be clear, I'm a bloody evolutionary biologist. I'm not, it's not been my area of specialization to be publishing in that domain,
It's
obviously.
one of mine, and I'm kind of bored with it too, so I understand.
Yeah, but I would recommend, and I've been recommending this for a while, that as a heterogenetic intervention. So again, philosophy as heterogenesis, to be like, hey, let's resurrect vitalism or vital animism or something like that. Let's go with this idea that vital equals generative process. Animism is relational philosophy. So process relationism, or evo process, evolutionary process, ecology, relationism, that these are all synonyms, vitalist animism. And then one of the places that one can really insert oneself with that rhetorical move is into the debate surrounding the new biology, right? Because everyone in that debate is saying, hey, there's all this new stuff going on, and there's a recentering of the organism and all these processes, but we don't want to affirm vitalism, and we don't, and it's like, why not? Like, what are you so afraid of? And they're only afraid, I would suggest, of a certain rhetorical discourse of a certain period in the development of ideas, which were associated with the dominance of a mechanicist way of thinking in biology in the early 20th century in particular, where vitalism was tarred and feathered. And it's like, we don't want to be identified with those people. It's like, yeah, but a lot of those guys, even though you're not going to inherit their full framework of thinking, but a lot of those vitalist embryologists and biophilosophers like Kungiem and all these guys, not to mention Bergson, have a lot to say which is of relevance. And then again, if you move away from the words into the diagrammatic, into the structures, if you think more like a mathematician for a second, then you realize that they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about this fundamentally generative creative process, that is what distinguishes life. And again, you might then generalize that and become a full-on vitalist like Peirce or Whitehead, or
Yeah.
Schelling.
I mean,
Um,
there's real ethical urgency here to make this switch to a vitalist ontology, because it's basically just acknowledging that life, the biological world, is not the sort of system that you could have complete knowledge of, which is to say the capacity to predict with certainty and control, and so come to master. It's granting agency to the non-human world. And
yeah, but
that's
even to the human world, because the human world has no agency in a world of pure secondness.
sure. Yeah. Right. Right. It's acknowledging that human beings have the capacity to act as creative agents, and also that we are immersed in a democracy of fellow creatures, is what it would put it. And this world respond the biological world at least, but even, I mean, it's quite obvious in quantum theory that the physical world is also to some degree responsive to our uh, observations, much less interventions. And so, there's a real sense in which the whole um,
And
there's a
observations are,
yeah, there
um,
is no observation that's not an intervention for sure. Um, but it's an as much a practical as it is a theoretical shift. It's as much a shift of heart as it is of mind, because um, when all of a sudden, when one accepts a vitalist ontology, you're making yourself vulnerable to the intention and the activity and the agency of a whole panoply of other beings that you didn't think existed when you were affirming a mechanistic ontology or a purely materialistic ontology.
Yeah, and you were probably, I mean, almost certainly, and I know you've written about this and we've talked about it, but in affirming that mechanistic ontology, you were, committing a major, performative contradiction, and also committing yourself thereby to a completely inconsistent ontology. And there's an urgent need for this in the discussion around like AI and technology and all that, because what's happening here. On the one hand, we have this narrative that this is happening to us. Technology is going to take our jobs, and this is all just like, so we exteriorize and give this weird agency to technology as though it's independent from humanity. But that's wrapped up in this determinism, like technological determinism, that this is just gonna happen. And at the same time, we have this other narrative about technology, which goes hand in hand. Like, the technologists are always giving us both of these narratives, that technology is a way that we, achieve dominion over nature, like that old chestnut, the old techne culture, techne nature, whatever, and techne culture, divide, or culture nature divide. And it's like, these, you can't have all of these things together. These are all really inconsistent ontologically. And that's why, like, in the new biology, and I haven't read it, but I saw you were responding on Twitter to an article by Johannes Jaeger, and you were saying you agreed up until the point when he caricatured panpsychism and conscious rocks or whatever. Again, that caricaturing, and I mean, I've probably been guilty of that myself in the past, but that caricaturing is a sign of a failure, to a lack of willingness to go beneath and actually do real ontological work. And that's the same thing when someone is like, look, there's all this amazing stuff going on in biology, and we have to move away from a mechanistic paradigm, but we're not vitalists. We're not, let's be clear, we're not vitalists. It's like, but if you actually reconstruct the ontology in the light of what we are becoming increasingly confident of in the domain of biology, you will be forced to become a vitalist, and that's okay. It's just a word, man. Like, chill. It's totally fine. So I think that, vitalism, or this. So if we go back to the free energy principle for a second, because I just want to, there's a quote that I want to pull out from well, somewhere in this essay. But this is as you and I are working on this kind of ontology, looking at Whitehead and obviously Peirce, and how these things might interact with a research program like the free energy principle and the organizational account, which has lots to offer as well, even though we've been critical of that. There's lots of goodness there, and again, I'm more interested in again, mapping those things onto each other. I mean, you sort of said that it wouldn't be the right approach to map Peirce onto Whitehead. I don't know. It's not about reducing one to the other. It's about, like, when we put these things together, do we it's relationism by putting them, overlaying them in a certain way, these structures. Do we find the insufficiencies in either of them, or do we just get something new? And that's why, to me, like, we were a bit critical of the organizational account and autopoiesis and all of that when we were responding to a couple of papers, but the relevance realization paper that we talked about a while ago. What I'm actually critical there is of this pitting against of these different research programs in a kind of superficial way. I'm like, should I say superficial? But that's the issue. It's not the critical thing. That's not an issue at all. Like, criticize away, but also do the constructive thing also, and that will involve dipping down into the ontology, and it involves this broader philosophical exercise, I think, and then seeing how these diagrammings, whether they're using stochastic differential equations as their foundational set of formalisms, or category theory, or whatever, how do these different diagrammings reveal different aspects, and then looking back at the ontology provided by the likes of Peirce and Whitehead and others, and how do these things all either can we bring them into some kind of consonance by creating a new thing there, not saying these have been saying the same thing all along. That's a boring thing to say. No, we can get a new thing by both pitting them against each other. Oh, there's something from evolutionary love that I really want to mention, but by both pitting them against each other, and but also using them to reconstruct each other, like allowing them to fight, but in a loving way. Like, the thing I wanted to say about the free energy principle, though, is Peirce says the existence of things consists in their regular behavior. Period. The existence of
Mhm.
things consists in their regular behavior. That's the free energy principle. That's what it's saying, right? There is an
Yeah.
attractive set which characterizes this thing as the thing that it is, and to the extent that it keeps returning to that set of habits, it will be that thing. To the extent that it doesn't do that anymore, it either dissipates and becomes no thing, or if that sufficiently changes, it's a new thing. You know, that's what it's saying.
Yeah.
And Peirce says it in one sentence, and that, of course, is also a description of evolution, of path dependency, etc. That's why the free energy principle is isomorphic with natural selection, or the Feynman path integral, or all of these different juicy analogies. That's what's exciting about something like the FEP, is that it's already a bunch of analogies in the physical formalisms, like all these different things from different domains of physics mapped onto each other. That's super useful. Why would we want to discard that? We might,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, as a physical description of, in Whitehead's terms, how a society of actual occasions maintains the dominant characteristic that define it as a society, FEP is brilliant. But it's not itself providing the metaphysics, uh, of where experience comes from. And so sometimes the advocates of FEP will, I think, covertly hypostatize the model, even though they're perfectly aware in other instances of the model territory distinction. And what an activists are really on about, I think, is the phenomenological um, uh, issue of firstness, right, in Peirce's terms, which is that you're never going to get outside of experience so as to explain it from the outside. And I think there's a fundamental compatibility between an activism and FEP if FEP doesn't hypostatize itself or think of itself as a metaphysical postulate, but as a properly physical description. And activism, I think, is important because it's insisting on the phenomenological conditions of science, but it leaves us also without a proper ontology, that both Peirce and Whitehead do a better job of providing. And so, but when you were mentioning mapping Peirce and Whitehead, who I think they're so convergent in so many ways. And it's not that I would want to avoid that. I mean, in some sense, what I wrote up the other day is an attempt to do that. But what I mean is there's no simple one-to-one correspondence between like firstness and, I mean, the closest we might try to put it would be firstness is like eternal objects or the primordial nature of God, contemplating eternal objects or envisaging eternal objects. Secondness is prehension, maybe.
That's a thirdness. So that's a really interesting thing that has come up in my mind a couple of times. There's a paper that I'll send you, which you'll know why I have issues with some of its conclusions. But it's a really good paper, a neglected additament on the argument to the neglected argument on the existence of reality of God or whatever. It's a cool little paper, but talking about whether firstness in a sense can't be absolutely first. Well, in the theological context, the envisagement of God, which is another thing that absolutely aligns between Peirce in some modes and Whitehead. That's a primordial thirdness. In fact, that thirdness comes first if you look at it that way. Peirce also has the most beautiful and evocative descriptions of habit taking in happening as a result of this action of pure indeterminate motion and relationality, right? And so in that sense, that would be a model of Genesis from a pure firstness. But there are elsewhere he talks about the role of God in that, and that ends up being more Whiteheadian, but it means you have a primordial thirdness. But the thing is, it's not an existent thirdness, because that's another point, right? No existent thing is really firstness, secondness, or thirdness. It partakes of all three. You
Yeah.
can only have them distinct as idealizations, and so
Mhm.
the God of the primordial thirdness is, and all these things that you did highlight in your article as well, is not in time, is not in space, and all of that, is in fact not an existent thing, is not actual, is real though, because
Mhm.
Peirce has this strong sense of the reality of the virtual in different terms, or the
Yeah.
reality of potential or whatever. But yeah, it's not existent or actual, because
Yeah.
all
So
actual things partake of all three principles.
right, right.
That's
So
what it
yeah,
is. That's it's what it is to become actual. Yeah.
right. No, I was trying different permutations of this mapping between the
Yeah.
triad and Whitehead's different categories and concepts, and none of them worked really. And there's lots of interesting parallels, but then it doesn't quite fit. And Whitehead makes this point at the beginning of Process and Reality when he says, it's not a fair criticism of one metaphysical scheme that it chooses to use different terms than another scheme. The ultimate arbiter should be experience, um, and how we decide among metaphysical schemes is a pragmatic issue for Whitehead, as it is for Peirce. Um, and it could be that while they're both monists of a sort, there's also as a matter of practicality, a sense in which we're pluralists too, because uh, there are various perspectives, like big, large scale theoretical perspectives that one could take on the nature of the universe that do justice to a lot of the available evidence. And no abstract system is ever going to accommodate all of the evidence.
Yeah.
And
And
so
the,
because
no, go on.
so
Sorry.
we always need to be, so that's why it's I think the best place for a metaphysician to be is sort of between these great elaborate systematizers, right? Because then you don't get captured by one way of thinking, even though you're aware of how far each of these modes of thought can take you. Um, and being stretched between them, you're able to generalize from uh, the areas where there are contradictions. You can generalize beyond that and hopefully arrive at some synthesis that would be different from
Hmm.
all of them in some sense.
Exactly, and thereby one would have justified one's own existence or one's own work in this sense, right? Like if you're just repeating what they have to say, then what's the point to some, and that we've discussed this privately, but that's one reason why some people sometimes overemphasize their own originality, perhaps, is a way of, we don't want to
Who
do,
shall not be named.
there shall not be now. Maybe they will be in a future talk. We
But
should be.
that's the evolution of science, of knowing, of how
Yeah.
each of us contributes. And I love what he says about the nervous system producing that our consciousness is the public spirit of this network of nerve cells. And on some level, that analogy I think can hold for our collective endeavor as a community of inquiry, to move the ball forward in whatever ways we can, with each of us making our contributions. There's a sense in which this triad is only, I mean, it's active everywhere, but in the case of conscious human beings, we've become metaconscious, as it were, of this habit-taking tendency. We're conscious of evolution, and that I think is where this can get theological too, or just spiritual. Um, that we now become the stewards of a process of creation.
um, Turning evolution into intelligent design, uh,
Yeah.
which is basically what we do as, like, say, a pharmacologist. When we find a molecule in nature that is of potential use to us, but we bring it into the lab and we try to make it less toxic or more specific in its targeting or whatever by engineering its evolution. That's turning evolution into intelligent design, with the obvious proviso that it's grounded on such a massive history of it. We're only the little cherry on the top, like intelligent design is not grounding, evolution is grounding, and then we can do a little bit of intelligent design on top of that. Although again, we talk about mind and all these different things, and we can talk about a fundamental intelligence of a certain kind. It's just not a personal intelligence for some of the reasons that we've already talked about. But yeah, what you're saying, about again not becoming a Peircean or a Whiteheadian, etc. Deriving one's own way of thinking from engaging with lots of different thinkers and the world in particular, like one's own firstness, is a very, very important way of embracing the diversification of one's thought, because all of our firstnesses are different by definition. We're all having different experiences, and we're highly plastic, experience dependent plasticity. Our developmental trajectories, not to mention obviously our bequests from the lineage. Our genetics are all different, but our development is all different. But I think these guys are also encouraging of that. And some more explicit than others. We've talked about Jung. Jung's like, well, I had to systematize a little bit in order to be able to do my work, but I'm kind of against system, and I don't think, you need your own system. Like, don't become a Jungian, essentially. And that's very Nietzschean, and probably direct influence there, like the best way you can follow me is to, be against me or whatever. That's Buddhist. If you see the Buddha in the road, kill him, which is an extreme way of putting it, but also that's the fallibilistic principle that is affirmed by both Whitehead and Peirce. No system of thought is ever complete. So why would you adopt it as if it could be? There's a couple of things I want to touch on relatively quickly before we stop, if if there's still time. Yeah, so I wanted to go back to the way he maps his triad onto well, he says biological development, but he's talking about Darwinism, and he says Darwinism represents a true cause, which in the sense he means is like a kind of an answer to a why question, so an Aristotelian sense of cause, I guess. Like you can use that kind of reasoning to ask why a particular that you've encountered is the way that it is. And so when he maps the we talked about this before, sporting as indeterminacy, Tykism, chance, variation, secondness as heritability, or anancasm, law, and then he talks about thirdness. And now he's trying to be very strictly Darwinian here, because he's mapping onto his understanding of Darwinian thought. And he says elimination of unfavorable characters is generalization by casting out sporadic cases, and generalization is thirdness. So selection is thirdness. And then he later says, well, we get a kind of imperfect correspondence here, and the imperfectness of the correspondence may be due to the theory of development itself. Like, he doesn't say it's because my triad might not be great, it's because the theory might be good. But absolutely, because selection is not simply the casting out of the unfavorable, but simultaneously the nourishing or the nurturing of the favorable. By casting out the unfavorable, you're actually making space and resources and all that. Let's not forget that natural selection is an economic theory fundamentally. It's predicated on a theory of scarcity. It's the generalization of Malthus into biology and all that. But by casting out the unfavorable, you favor the favorable, so it's got a nourishing and nurturing aspects to it. And of course, one can go into debates between, the relative role of competition and collaboration and all of that sort of stuff. But bracketing that, in evolutionary love, and Peirce totally gets this, right? He just doesn't develop this line of argument in that particular part of this essay. Because in evolutionary love, when he talks about agapism, so that's the evolution towards a goal, right, which is thirdness, it's generalization and purposive evolution and all of that, as opposed to chance and law. He says, this is really beautiful, it's not by dealing out cold justice to the circle of my ideas that I can make. So the action of mind is evolutionary, right? And he's talking about the loving and nurturing aspect of creative evolution, and he's giving a kind of psychological account of it there in this particular section. It's not by dealing out cold justice to the circle of my ideas that I can make them grow, but by cherishing them and tending them as I would the flowers in my garden. the philosophy we draw from John's gospel is that this is the way mind develops. And for the cosmos, only so far as it is yet mind, and so has life, is it capable of further evolution. So I just wanted to point that out in that where he talks about Darwinian evolution and he tries to be like strictly Darwinian and say it's the elimination of unfavorable characters, we should never forget that the corollary of that is in fact just the nurturing, just the favoring of the favorable character. It's tautological, totally tautological, but yeah, that corresponds nicely with what he says there in Evolutionary Love, I think.
Yeah, that's beautiful. No, I'm tempted to continue on the theological track with the mention of John's gospel, but I think I'm too, my mind is too tired for that right now.
Well, okay, one more thing that I'll say then, and hopefully elicit a response from you. So I'm jumping around a little bit now, just because there are a couple of things that I thought would be nice to highlight. Like right at the end, where he's talking about the triad in physics, he says a whole bunch of like amazing stuff. He basically things you could map onto like multi-way graphs, like I said, many worlds, computation on state machines. Like he kind of describes evolution in terms of this state transition and basically rule-based transition from state to state, which is computation, notwithstanding his fundamental principle of continuity, which is a difference between a pan-computationalism and the kind of thing that he's saying. He says all of that stuff, but he talks about, again, habits and how the acquisition of habits, or basically what a thing is its habits, right? And he says both events and substances are bundles of habits. And he turns this into a selection principle, right? In the sense that anything that fails to take a habit just simply disappears. So things that can take habits are necessarily selected for just by virtue of their capacity to take habits, right? But then he says that substances, because he also posits at the beginning, it's like pre-space, this sort of like quantum pre-space, things like at the outset, the connections of space were probably different for one substance and part of a substance from what they were for another. Different points adjacent or near one another from the motions of one body would not be so for another. Like space is not at all homogeneous. Like again, he says different things. Like he does talk about the progress of evolution being from the homogeneous to the heterogeneous, which he takes from Spencer, but also this state of pure indeterminacy, which is the pure firstness, is full of every possibility. Again, this is what Whitehead would say, right? Every possibility is there, but in indeterminate form. But he says space can be kind of homogenized in this early stage by substances carrying their habits with them in their motions through space, tending to render the different parts of space alike. And I really like this. This is a really rich way of, again, this is just a classic kind of evolutionary argument in a certain sense, but thinking about this in terms of the spreading effect of the principle of least action, starting as a kind of local principle, but local habits becoming more global. Also, things like replication as a method of reducing free energy by making one's neighbors similar to one another. One isn't constantly having to find new ways to like new principles of least action, basically new paths of least action, because the homogenization of the landscape makes traversing it relatively easy, although this can never be absolutized, of course, because of the work of Tychasm. But it's also culture, requires less action to keep track. Hang on, my notes are all mixed up. It's also kind of culture, right? That we homogenize ourselves, we homogenize worldviews, and we expect people to conform to sets of norms and all that to make them predictable, basically, to make one another predictable. We were even talking about this in the psychedelic discussion last time, that you were saying that the egoic state is a kind of ethical responsibility that we have to one another to maintain ourselves as fairly consistent personalities and all that kind of stuff. And this, Peirce just talking about in a very kind of abstract, but also obviously cosmological way, substances traveling around and spreading their habits as they do. Again, that maps so well into a lot of the ways people talk about the free energy principle as a kind of scale-free scale through patterns. So there's I've kind of said all that in a very abbreviated manner. There's a bunch of stuff to develop there, but very striking, that last section on the application of the triad in physics. How many different things, how many different pretty contemporary research programs you could think of as being anticipated in Peirce's thought there. And
Mm-hmm.
Peirce's contemporaries evidently didn't really understand him, and he found it really difficult to get his message across. But I think with, another 150 years, 100 and whatever years of science, a lot of the things that Peirce was saying, and a lot of the extrapolations that he was making of his own thought, and obviously Whitehead is somewhat similar, just make more and more sense and are more and more obvious in the way they perhaps were obvious to him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was really floored by that section on physics as well, and um, the way that time and then space are themselves emergent
Mm.
regularities that spread in this way as habits increasingly permeate um, the universe and smoothing out space. Uh, a couple of days ago, Richard Dawkins was up late, probably had a couple of glasses of wine, and he said he tweeted out the Darwinian theory of gravity. Things that go up have long since disappeared, and we are left with only the things that go down. And a lot of physicists were hating on him there, and I think he's a little oversimplified, but he's kind of trying to think with Peirce a little bit, but I
Yeah.
don't know that I don't know that he's ever actually read Peirce.
Also, when it comes to kind of a law of attraction, Peirce will say things, Peirce just has all these little pithy generalizations of selectionism, basically, which of course is how Dawkins has structured his thought, but in a maybe less expansive, maybe slightly less expansive way. But Peirce will say that, things that are not attracted to other things just go off to the infinite.
Mhm.
So in
Mhm.
any given region of space, you're left with things that are going to be relating according to laws of attraction, just by definition, because anything that didn't fit into that, it's just gone. Which is a not entirely dissimilar idea to what Dawkins is saying there, actually.
Yeah, I mean the profundity and tautology of evolutionary logic is a bit of a mind fuck because it's like so deeply satisfying as an account, but also so because it's so like cheap as an explanation. You almost wish there was more, but it's also enough on some
Yeah,
level
yeah.
because you can see how this deep theology can pour out of it at the same time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have to be wary of it, and that's why I like to refer to it as trivial. And you have to remember that, famously, really, natural selection, for example, or natural selection with its various augmentations, even cannot explain in toto any bare particular. It's just a set of principles. Again, the free energy principle. You shouldn't think of these things as reductive. You know, it's something that to the extent that these are useful principles, that they can give you purchase. They can allow you to start articulating, developing an explanation, never a complete explanation, because there's always going to be this taikic thing. There's always the inexplicable firstness. There's always chance involved, which is what, again, makes it seem cheap in a way. But well, we won't talk about how determinism is even cheaper because it puts everything behind the veil. Everything
Mm.
is inexplicable. There are no explanations in a world of pure secondness, right? But of course, no explanation is ever complete in a world that has firstness in it. That's just the principle here. But these, again, Popper is good on this, and Michael Ruse is a fairly famous philosopher of biology, but some people were very angry with Popper, like in the I guess in the 70s, when he said that natural selection is a tautology. It's not a falsifiable hypothesis, and it is in fact the kind of tautological posit or postulate which grounds a metaphysical research program. And
Mm.
people are like, oh no, he doesn't understand evolution at all. This is completely wrong. No, it's hard science. And it's like, no, he groks the structure of an evolutionary explanation. He's not refuting it. He says, I have always considered myself an evolutionist. But this is exactly the thing. like the fringe principle, and I actually applaud Carl for Friston for fully owning this. The fringe principle is a tautology. Natural selection is a tautology. These are tautological postulates. They're attempts at a minimal postulate, like 1, 2, 3, that can ground you can develop a system of reasoning about particulars on the basis of them. And you need something like that. You can't just start from nothing.
I think you can escape what might seem like a circular explanation by remembering the importance of asymmetry here and the asymmetry of temporal process. Um, that things that are around today are around today the way that they are because things survived in the past, that were like them. And the things that didn't survive aren't here anymore. But if you bring in that, I mean, this leads to while strictly logically it's a tautology, metaphysically or ontologically, if you affirm asymmetry, you get out of what might otherwise then just be a closed loop, and you can see how a creative advance is possible, and how what you want to get out of this tautology is evolution. You only get evolution out of it if there is this asymmetrical process, this directional evolution, right? And I think that additional, it's a posit on the one hand, but it's also, I think there's a phenomenological basis for it. And just the way that, yes, we can distinguish immediate experience, reflection upon that experience, and the learning which occurs as we do that. Right?
1, 2, 3. Yeah. Yeah, no, perfect. And I think even Peirce runs afoul a little bit of what he accuses. I mean, he is pretty Hegelian, obviously, and you mentioned like way early in the talk that he can't resist shitting on Hegel. I mean, he has some really interesting things to say, and he's shitting on Hegel. And certainly, he feels a need to differentiate himself from Hegel, partly because of the similarities, which he also owns up to. And some will say that later in his career he becomes more sympathetic to Hegel, but evolutionary love is pretty late on, and he basically says there that, again, he's got these 3 modes of evolution: trichasm, anancasm, and agapasm. And he says, oh, and by the way, people may hear inconsistency in me saying like anancasm, trichasm, or trichism. He's got, like, it's a bit arcane, and I kind of wasn't necessarily, but there's a difference between trichasm and trichism. Trichasm is the kind of fact of chance existing, and trichism is the, like, doctrinaire acknowledgement. It's the position, to say that this is a principle, and then like trichasticism or something like that would be the argument that this is the dominant principle. So he's got, he's doing arcane things with the language here, but he basically says that Hegel is an ananchism or an ananchistic philosophy. So it's actually a law-based philosophy that masquerades as an agapism. And that one of the ways you can tell this is that he thinks that Hegel is a thinker of, and I know like different Hegelians have different takes on this, and it depends probably on which work of Hegel's you're actually reading, which is why there are all these plural readings, and also which secondary tradition that you're in. But he, like many people, reads Hegel as a thinker of final synthesis, as a thinker of ultimate goal. That there in the future there is a final state, and he says that because that ends up being a foreordained final state, that there's a global telos, that in fact is a law-based, because it's not novel, right? So the final state is not novel. But interestingly, elsewhere, and I actually fully agree. I mean, whether that's a fair characterization of Hegel or not is beside the point. I totally agree. I'm very resistant to the idea of a global telos. I mean, there's a global directionality in a sense, but it is emergent in that it emerges from all these local goals and purposes and directionality, and it is not in itself purposive or heading towards some final goal. And I think that's also how people would think of Teilhard de Chardin, right, as heading towards the. But Peirce does partake of that logic, as we discussed, when he posits the idea that the final state of the universe is pure secondness. But he's then careful to distinguish again that as an ideal posit to ground his sense of an evolutionary continuum rather than an actually existent state. So he'll often will say, there's this tendency towards more and more law-like behavior, but that there will never be an actual existent state in which there's no Teichism. And I probably would go further, and I would just say that in a sense, and it's an impossible thing to quantify, but the influence of Teichism is never really reduced globally. Like, it's always there and always necessary. And elsewhere, Peirce will talk about catastrophism. So the idea, catastrophism, like a meteorite hits the planet and wipes out a huge percentage of life on the planet, and that opens up all this novel niche space, right? And that's been, in classic evolutionary theory, that was seen as a kind of really a teichastic model, I would say, in the sense that this is a completely contingent event, which renders the whole history of evolutionary trajectories and renders all evolutionary history completely unpredictable. Peirce, I think, will slightly inelegantly, even though he's also right, that can be framed as a secondness because it's a pure reactivity. Like, the thing comes in and it just has this brute blind effect of wiping things out. Sure, that's a way of thinking about it as a secondness, but it's also a kind of profound chance event, which again, in microcosm, these things are just happening constantly. And that's why the landscape is always diversifying. And that's why you can never have a global principle of least action, say. It is a fundamentally local principle. And because every persistent thing is continually deriving its own path of least action, the entire landscape is constructed of these locally, defined paths of least action, and therefore it's constantly shifting all of the time in these different ways. So there's a constant need to heterogenize. There's a constant need for this generative novelty. And I just think, even though, I can see Peirce's function for his infinite poles, my friend and I have joked about this idea of the eschaton crystal, the crystal at the end of time, the universe of pure inertia, right, where structure is finally fixed once and for all. And I think, again, fine to have that as a limit concept, just to remember that there's no evidence, as Peirce himself would say, for taking that on board as any kind of like real metaphysical or ontological, existent future.
Yeah. Peirce's characterization of Hegel, as you just expressed it, is quite reminiscent of Schelling, who says that Hegel, Schelling has this distinction between positive and negative philosophy. Negative philosophy would be more the logical, conceptual form. You could even say law-based form, and positive philosophy is more experiential, more rooted in the more existential, even rooted in like the fact that existence precedes essence, as the existentialists would later say. And so Schelling says Hegel is a negative philosopher who masquerades as a positive philosopher. Like, he thinks he's giving you existence, but actually he's just describing essences. And so I wonder if Peirce was giving his own rendition of what he had read in Schelling's criticism of Hegel there.
Yeah, probably. No, that's really interesting to point that out. It's also the Hegel that the French thinkers are all reacting against. I mean, other than the ones who are positively embracing it, but the French thinkers of the generation of Deleuze and others. That's the Hegel of Kojève, right? Who is the thinker of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and this idea then of a final global goal for history. And I know, again, a lot of Hegelians would dispute that characterization of Hegel, right? and
Yeah.
many people would say the great thing about Hegel is that he's not a thinker of synthesis and is always a perturbation. And I just I've read a bunch of Hegel, but haven't read all of it and don't have a synthetic. In particular, I haven't read The Science of Logic, so people say that's where you have to go um, to get the full picture.
The great thing about all these philosophers is they are obscure enough that multiple interpretations will be rewarding and valuable.
Productive misreadings, right? And that's the firstness again, the firstness of my reading, your reading, the eisegesis as opposed to exegesis. So
Hmm.
the function of chiasm in evolution, which is inexhaustible, the inexhaustible excess that is always there driving the engine of creativity, the zero force evolutionary law from
Hmm.
Brandon and McShay.
Right. I love his line about when he's talking about intuition as a legitimate way uh, of knowing. I think he doesn't use abduction here, but I think he's gesturing towards this. Um, or he says intuition is the regarding of the abstract in a concrete form by the realistic hypostatization of relations. This is the one sole method of valuable thought. Very shallow is the prevalent notion that this is something to be avoided. You might as well say at once that reasoning is to be avoided because it has led to so much error. Quite in the same Philistine line of thought would that be, and so well in accord with the spirit of nominalism that I wonder why someone does not put it forward.
Yeah,
um,
that's so good. And it's like before saying, Poincaré says mathematicians do not deal in objects, but in relations among objects. So that's the realistic hypostatization of relations. Content to them is irrelevant. They're interested in form only. It's also, we talked about Deutsch, and many differences with Deutsch, but his definition of computation, the representation of abstract objects and their relations by real objects and their movement. And Whitehead says super similar things in his introduction to mathematics as well. I mean, that's diagramming.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, yeah, there's so much in these essays on intuition and abduction, which we hit a bit in the relevance realization talk. And I think there's a lot of things we need to develop there and even clarify probably some of the stuff I was sounding off about in that, because I was just
And we
struck by
should follow up with John Vervicki about having
yeah
that conversation too.
I would suggest that we also perhaps do another, hopefully this is the first of a number of sessions devoted to Peirce essays. There's a bunch that would be great, and some of them are very short, and we could chunk them together maybe. But the neglected argument. This is going to take us further into the theological territory, and you'll see me squirming, but it's actually a beautiful characterization of abduction that and intuition that he has in that. And again, I think we can. Yeah, I mean, there's a way of very much, and you were actually beautifully articulating it before, what enactivism has to offer in terms of its phenomenological um, emphasis. Peirce is very much giving us a way of thinking about that and the way that plugs into logic, the way phenomenology, in a sense, logic is dependent upon this intuitive capacity that we have as embodied, embedded, inactive beings. Whatever, extended. Yeah, forgot the fourth E for a second.
Affect. Don't forget the A, the affective as well.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. So Peirce gives us that, and I think what the thing I was obviously reacting against them, just giving short shrift to abduction in that paper, but also where they're going wrong there a little bit for me is in their so they're rightly emphasizing the need for this phenomenological grounding in firstness, but then they're trying to pit the FEP against the organizational account at the level of formalisms. Like they're saying, here's this phenomenological thing, and then we have this organizational account, which even at the level of the formal is superior to the free energy principle. And I'm like, I just don't see that. I don't see that. It's not saying the organizational account doesn't have its attractive qualities. And I've been re-engaging with some of the stuff that I haven't read for a while on constraint closure and stuff. And I mean, there's a lot of great stuff there, but it's just another abstraction, another diagram which we can make use of. And again, there's a complementarity to these things, and that only gets lost again when we whatever Peirce says there, but when we hypostasize, inelegantly. That's when we go, these two formalisms, these two models are at odds with each other. No, they're both just different ways of diagramming things. And if some of them, if some formal language can capture a certain kind of real relation better than another, then we just gain from or even if the attention of whoever has been developing that formal language has been different, there's an irreducible firstness in the actual theoreticians here, then by combining their insights, mapping them against each other, we're gonna learn more than by just trying to give short shrift to one of them. And I just don't think, by the way, it's funny, like I don't think the FEP is necessarily fundamentally computationalist. It's all about stochastic differential equations, like it's not fundamentally computationalist in that sense. And stochastic differential equations, random dynamical systems, what do they all have? Well, they have a teichic aspect to them. There's always a Brownian term, a stochastic term, a dissipative term, etc., in any of those formalisms. And that, some would argue, is what computers can't do and why they're not creative. Again, we can argue about that, but yeah, I
Yeah.
don't.
Computers aren't buggy enough to mimic
Yeah,
these
well,
kinds of evolutionary processes.
yeah, I've got a couple of books that I want to. I've got a billion books that I want to read, and many of them are relevant to this work. But there are great philosophical tomes about how computers can't do contingency, and there are great philosophical tomes about how they can. But I think that the Peirce way of just going right to the core of it and saying that this fundamental discreteness, you can model a stochasticity, you can model a teichic element, but there's emergent vagueness, but no fundamental vagueness, let's say. And that's, of course, how a lot of determinists try to cash out the apparent stochasticity, the apparent vagueness in the world, is by saying, oh, well, you can always nest an indeterministic, we know this, we've talked about this many times, you can always nest an indeterministic formalism within a deterministic system, and vice versa. Formally, it's undecidable. The question is whether computation is fundamentally limited because it is irrevocably this kind of discrete, state machine as its fundamental thing. Again, maybe it's just, I don't, again, this comes down to this, age-old question on the discrete versus the continuous. Maybe it's not a complete ontology. I don't think it is. But that wouldn't make it not incredibly useful, and even much more useful than the kind of lip service the anti-computationists, let's say, give to saying, oh, well, these are useful models, but it's like it's much more profound than that. They're as useful as any models, as long as we remember that they might, like all models, have some degree of limitation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was reading, and we'll have to wrap it up here because I'm getting pretty hungry for my dinner, but a little bit more about quantum computing and how that proposed technology that Google, IBM, others are making some progress on, that there's certain applications for it in the domain of simulating physical processes where quantum effects are super relevant, whether it's understanding better how certain pharmaceuticals work in relation to synapses, or understanding different chemical reactions, understanding different astrophysical processes, that when quantum effects are relevant to how things are happening in the physical world, having quantum computation to simulate that will give us a better understanding of what's going on there, and how to really aim our pharmaceutical design more accurately, right? Because we can better model these things, and so the extent to which the people who defend computationalism are talking about the same thing as those who are criticizing it is not always clear to me. I think the game is changing very quickly, and that's why, the whole project of polycomputing and whatnot that Chris Fields and Mike Levin and others are working on, is I still have an open mind about it.
Yeah.
Even if I also understand and can often agree with a lot of the criticisms coming from uh, Jaeger or Vervaeke or Thompson or whoever it might be, who's more in an activist camp.
Yeah. And I think without going there in any depth, because I'm also really brain dead now after this wonderful conversation, uh, of course, quantum mechanics is ontologically open in an important way, but a deflationary way of thinking about it, which just means that it doesn't come with an ontology, would be a sort of cubist way of thinking about it. And quantum mechanics is a certain way of thinking about probabilities and the resolution of those probabilistic judgments in the act of taking a measurement. In the act of making an observation, we're resolving our doubt. And we may also be ontologically resolving something that didn't have a determinate state. But that's already going further than the theory necessarily has to go. And I sent you that thing, the Schrodinger quote. One thing we didn't get into in this discussion, which is super important, we're not going to develop it now, but Peirce's like really strident refutations of determinism. I mean, we've been circumlocuting that territory, but basically, he saw the discovery of non-Euclidean geometries and things as a refutation of the precision of certain axioms in mathematics, and he said this has to affect all of our thinking. This has to affect metaphysics. There is absolutely no reason to believe, from experience or formally anymore, that there is any absolute precision in the world. Again, cynicism. That's his principle of continuity, and that's a refutation of determinism. But Schrodinger, says to Einstein, God knows I'm no friend of probability theory. I've hated it from the first moment when our dear friend Max Born, he of the Born rule in quantum mechanics, gave it birth. For it could be seen how easy and simple it made everything in principle, everything ironed and the true problems concealed. Like we've said, determinism actually conceals all the problems because everything, world of pure secondness, everything is pre-given, everything is preordained. So Schrodinger is just being completely non-philosophical there. But at the same time, sorry, mate, probability theory has kind of won, in the sense that indispensably from quantum mechanics to biology to machine learning, which is basically all probability theory in some level, we're not escaping this. And in fact, one thing, again, there are so many things for this project that you and I are working on together and independently, and helping each other to shape our thoughts, writing together and all that. But a serious engagement with the history of probability theory is also an important part of like, how have we learned to deal with chance formally? If chance, Tykism in Peirce's sense, and I completely believe this, is fundamental to processes of creativity, of generativity in the universe, then understanding in depth how chance has been handled. And again, if you're coming out of evolutionary theory, you're always working with that and all these different levels and all these different material manifestations, which you and I have talked about in other discussions. Obviously mutation, stochastic gene expression, behavior itself. Contingent encounters between organisms, all of this. Like, there's just chance everywhere. And again, that's why you'll never have a complete explanation. But really thinking deeply about the nature of chance, and probability theory as a way of doing that, is very, very crucial, as if we're moving away from a deterministic conception of the universe. Sorry, Schrodinger. And what do we get when we try to maintain that determinism? Well, we know we get many worlds or Birmian mechanics or whatever, and these things have their own aberrant consequences. Not to mention that exactly I'm just saying this again, but exactly the problem Schrodinger identifies about concealing the problems. It's like, cannot say it enough times. Determinism is Mysterianism. right?
Mm,
Nothing is explicable. Nothing is explicable in a deterministic world. You only have as if explanations.
mm. Yeah, and I think it's wonderful that Peirce, you know, 15, almost 2 decades before Whitehead and Russell write the Principia, and then, 30, 40 plus years before Gödel, he's already sort of given up on this logicist project to formalize, uh, the axioms of mathematics. It took the others, it even took Whitehead a little longer, but eventually I think was like Peirce sort of liberated to approach it, metaphysics in a new way, as itself, in a more scientific and fallibilist way. Um,
And
and
neither of them are giving up on logic by any means. They're
no,
giving up on logicism, right?
mhm.
Uh, yeah.
But by thematizing vagueness as not just a function of our own confusion, but as having ontological significance, um, as well as chance, and building in error correction into our epistemology and all of this, um, I think does represent, people say philosophy doesn't advance. Um, I think this evolutionary, rendering of maybe what a generation or so prior was, um, to Peirce and the pragmatist, was Kantian transcendentalism, to historicize that and to see the transcendental nature of evolutionary logic, which, yeah, as we were discussing offline, um, is an improvement on Kant. Um, that, let me see if I can get this right. What's transcendental for the individual organism is, uh, empirical for, or historically emergent or contingent for the species.
That's
Um,
conventionalism. That's the deep conventionalism
mm,
that we talked about. Our Umwelt, let's say, to go Uxkul, is a convention of the lineage, uh, or
right.
is grounded in. But our perspectives are still irreducibly multiple.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. And then you get the, in this evolutionary picture, new generals, new universals, if you want, emerge in the course of evolutionary history. And so you get to be a realist, a Platonic realist, without being an essentialist. Um, and that's the genius of Peirce, is that he really allows us to salvage a lot of what, um, the metaphysicians going all the way back have wanted, but to do so in a way that's open and not closed, that's not essentialist, and that permits, if, for all practical purposes, infinite learning. And truth
mm,
is, he's not a relativist about truth, but it is forever out ahead of us, right? And we can only asymptotically approach it and approximate it. Um, and yeah, it's a beautiful vision. I would love to continue reading more of Peirce's essays, if you want to stay on him for a while. I've really, caught the
yeah.
bug.
Yeah, no, we should definitely. I mean, I think we should do soon Whitehead's function of reason because we've talked about
Oh,
that.
Philo. Gosh, he's hungry too.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, function of reason.
We should do Whitehead's function of reason sometime soon as well. I mean, we also have said we're going to
Yeah.
do some Schelling, which we should definitely do as well. But yeah, no, I'm super happy to do more Peirce as well. I mean, we'll mix all these things up, but yeah, we could definitely do a few sessions in a row on Peirce if that's your preference. I'm trying to find this quote. Bloody hell, it's in my notes here somewhere, but basically Peirce very explicitly says, and it would be lovely to read it in his own words. Why can't I find it? So annoying. That the process of evolution is a process of evolution in which the Platonic forms themselves are evolving, right? So
Mm,
this is makes it totally okay for me. And yes, this rescues realism. And this is also what I was trying to get at in my recent chat with and ongoing chat with hopefully particularly Chris Fields and Mike. That yeah, we can be realists about generals. We don't have to be like completely, and we can still also maintain this observe. We can be perspectivalists as well. we can maintain an observer relativity. So we're like post-Kantian, not non-Kantian or anti-Kantian or whatever, like our access is conditioned, and it's conditioned precisely in this historical manner, which is a kind of nesting thing, where yes, the transcendental of the individual is the empirical of the lineage. But again, that is still ongoing in the differentiation of perspectives within lineages. A lineage is just a super individual in this sense, and the diversification of perspectives, of phenotypes with their perspectival correlates in individuals feeds back onto the diversification of the lineage, right? There are ways that acquire, a bit Lamarckian, and certainly Peirce saw himself actually as vindicating Lamarck to some significant degree, like a cosmological Lamarckism. And again, should we be afraid of that because he's been so discredited? It's like, no, we're not taking Lamarck on whole hog. But we're not saying that August Weismann refuted Lamarck by cutting the tails off mice, breeding the mice, and finding that the babies didn't have foreshortened tails. It's like, that's not a refutation of the inheritance of acquired change. Darwin himself believed in the inheritance of acquired change. And you probably find quite quickly that without the inheritance of acquired change, in more than just the soma, like in more than just the germline, rather, the opposite of what I said, in more than just the germline, your evolutionary theory will not work ultimately. So again, there need to be ways, and we know of various mechanisms, and that includes everything up to and including like Koszybskian time fixing, which is culture, and how we pass on habits behaviorally, and then the Baldwin effect and yada yada yada. Yeah, look, it's endlessly rich, this stuff. You can juice a lot out of a basic evolutionary triad, that's for sure. So yeah, we could do evolutionary love. We could do the neglected argument on the reality of God, which I think again is a really interesting text for abduction, but how that can link into a kind of spiritual perspective and theological perspective. And maybe I'll articulate in more detail my mosaic picture where I'm trying to restrict the usage of that term. I mean, I'm basically eliminating the usage of the term, because I'm saying if it's only in the prosaic, so it's only in our direct experience, well, I'm very much an apophatic mystic about the prosaic, and I think Peirce is, like you just can't speak of it direct, like to speak of it is to already be taking a perspective of thirdness on it. Anyway, yeah, let's work it out and do some more Peirce. 100%.
Yeah. No, there's the Garden of Eden, there's the fall, and there's redemption. Yeah. Well, I'd love to go there next with those two essays. So to be continued.
Cool, man. This was great.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you next week.
Good, man.